Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Wendy Hernandez, and on behalf of Farella, Braun, and Martel, I would like to thank you again for joining us today in our September nonprofit education series. So a little bit about me. I am a part of the firm's private client industry group, specifically a rising associate in the family wealth group. I'm currently a corporate law clerk, past the California bar, pending admission, and I work primarily with exempt organizations. And I'm joined today by my co-panelist, Afshan Paarlberg, attorney and visiting assistant professor at Indiana University in the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Afsha is also a first-year PhD student in philanthropic studies at Indiana University. And Afsha and I met as co-panelists at another presentation for a University of California alumni event, where our common interest in nonprofit law led us to stay in touch and now stand or sit before you today. Neither one of us is a diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist, but given that this is a very hot topic in the industry, we're very excited to share with you our take on pushing for diversity in philanthropy. So let me go ahead and go on to the next slide.
Thank you, Wendy, for inviting me to be here today. And hello, everyone in California. We're 3 hours ahead here in Indiana, so you can start to see the sun and the shade changing every few minutes. By the end of the evening, it might be dark on this side. But I just wanted to kind of give some quick disclaimers. As you already know, today is just general information. It's not intended to be legal advice or attorney-client relationships. And the presentation doesn't necessarily represent the perspectives of Indiana University and all the boring stuff that's up there on the screen, but just wanted to throw that out there before we get started and dive into our conversation today.
Thanks, Afsha. So let's dive right in. What is diversity? Such a broad topic, and it can have so many meanings depending on the context that it's being discussed in. So for the purposes of our presentation today, Afsha and I came up with the following definition, which is the practice of involving or including a variety of people from a range of social, ethnic, gender, religious abilities, and sexual orientations. So that's a mouthful. Let's do a quick temperature check in the room. If this definition works for you, can we see a thumbs up, either or an emoji thumbs up? If you'd like to add to this definition, can you insert a few suggestions in the chat just to see what the room is feeling?
You know, and I'll just add that diversity can be from a couple of different perspectives, and we're going to try to give you a broad overview of both of those today so we can consider organizational diversity and what sort of the implications of that are. But we can also think about social diversity in our communities, and we're going to try to touch on both of those to give you an overview of what that means. And we've got Michael Scott up here because, you know, if the only thing you walk away with is the Michael Scott smell test, you know, if it's something that Michael Scott would do, it probably raises red flags everywhere. So we put him up here as our reminder and as sort of our smell and litmus test, even if everything from the legal perspective doesn't sink in.
I see thumbs up and I see more thumbs up in the chat box. So looks like that works for us. Okay, so in order to push for more diversity, it's important to first know what the current state of diversity is in the field. So we looked at data and we provided an infographic for you that I'll go ahead and break down. This was borrowed from the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Justice. And a few key facts that this infographic demonstrates is, first, historically, trends in charitable giving for people of color or people of color-led organizations have been very low. In 2014, 7.4% of giving was for people of color. So that was $2 billion, which is a lot of money. But those $2 billion were out of a pool of $28 billion. This is data for 2014. PRE also published a report called Mismatched Philanthropy's Response to the Call for Racial Justice. They just published that, and that report covers data up into 2018. And a few things that we're aware of is that the social uprisings in 2020 really sparked historic levels of giving to address racial justice and likely pushed these numbers forward, right? We saw an increase in grants of people of color. They used the, and I'm looking at, I don't know if you all can see my mouse, but I'm looking at this data right here. We saw a small uptick from 1.1% to 1.7% of those $2 billion increase from 2005 to 2009. But in 2020, data which is still pending because it's not complete, the social uprisings really sparked historic levels of giving. Nonetheless, the uptick in charitable giving in the past decade has still been a pretty slow uptick. And so the takeaway for this slide and this infographic really is that though there is an amount of funding for racial justice and racial equity that has been increasing in the last decade or two, it's still a very minuscule uptick when it's compared to the overall domestic giving. And so we just want you to hold on to this as a basic framework as we talk through.
Yeah, and similarly, this slide up here, I've borrowed an infographic from a report titled Everyday Donors of Color. It was recently published by the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And this is up here just to give you an idea of the philanthropic tendencies of communities of color and maybe where the breakdowns are in terms of how different communities give and where they give their time as compared to the overall population. And, you know, whether it's through volunteering or whether it's, you know, through crowdfunding, donating goods, there's philanthropic tendencies across all different communities, but it's a matter of recognizing the ways in which people are giving. Next.
So what does this mean? It's a lot of data, right, to sit with, but generally this means that there is a steady increase of philanthropists dedicating their efforts towards diversity. And that's both internally within their staff and externally within grantee and grant making. So there are various levels of legal implications that can come to light that we want to discuss. And so we'll go ahead and go through 3 examples that will allow us to look at this from the perspective of grant making organizations to anchor our discussion. So the first example kind of beat me to it. Here we go.
So here we have our first request for proposal. And what we're trying to do is issue spot whether any of this language might trigger anything. If we're trying to, from a grant making perspective, promote greater diversity within an organization, you know, how do each of these proposals sort of hold up? And right, this first one is, please share any bylaw provisions or internal policies that demonstrate your organization's DEI priorities. And, you know, it's not mandatory, right? It's asking for any bylaw provisions, right? So it's not mandating that in order to submit a request for funding that an organization have these, but having been on the other side, sometimes there can be that thought process that if a grant maker is asking for these things, these are important in order to seek the funding. And I don't have a bylaw provision yet, but we've been talking about DEI priorities, you know, maybe we should just move forward and, you know, let's have a meeting, let's vote, let's add in a DEI committee, let's adopt it into our bylaws and let's include it in this, you know, grant making into this grant proposal. And, that's a moment of celebration, except for, is that really the intended effect that we're going for? And, there's some ways that we want to think about, right? There could be a few steps down the line where this kind of goes in a direction where we don't want it to. And one of the concerns is that an organization hasn't necessarily gone through a cultural shift or come up with a plan in terms of how to implement that new committee. And so now we have it on the bylaws. We're, as directors, needing to uphold our fiduciary duties and follow the bylaws, but we've elected new board members. We haven't necessarily put things into action, and that provision just falls by the wayside. And now we're, intending to do something good as an organization, but now we're really not compliant. And there's that risk of breaching your fiduciary duty or duty of care as a director too. So, perhaps it doesn't have the intended effect from either side, even though the thought is to promote DEI and to make, the organization uphold into this, right? So Wendy, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah. And of course, from the grant making perspective, the grant maker wants to see impact, wants to see that their funds are going to DEI efforts or DEI priorities. And so because of the issues that Afshan just mentioned, there may not be that impact that the grant maker is seeking. So that's another issue.
And if you guys are issue spotting along with us, feel free to throw them in the chat. We'd love to, we can certainly pull from them and share them along the way. These are some of the ones that we come up with, but issue spotting is an endless, activity. So feel free to chime in through the chat. So we've got this second request for proposal, and it says, please include in your proposal or budget any needs you have in addressing your DEI priorities. And this language is a lot softer, right? It's not necessarily asking for a specific way in which an organization needs to present its priorities. It's a little more open-ended. And it doesn't necessarily, a few steps down the line, obligate an organization to something unless it scrambles to do the same thing. But overall, this is just a way for both a funder and a grantee to talk through what those goals are and see where those goals align, and an opportunity for an organization to think about it and or request funding, right? Sometimes these new initiatives require funding in order to be able to implement them. And so this is an opportunity for it to go at a pace that is not premature and to be able to incorporate those things. And so you can see the language is a little softer, but it may have a more desired long-term impact within an organization.
I don't have anything to add, and I don't see anyone in the chat jumping in, so I'll go ahead and third request for proposal.
And this third one is about demonstrating how the grant will diversify your staff. And I think this is going to lead us into a conversation that Wendy is going to take us through about just some of the ways in which an organization can go right or wrong, depending on how you go with it, and take us through some of the implications. And when you talk about diversifying staff in particular, now you're touching on an area of employment law, right? So you're thinking about, from a federal perspective, maybe Title VII or Section 1981, which have provisions, talking about issues of racial discrimination. But then you also have a whole set of labor and employment laws. And this is where, going into that route may be an opportunity to work with legal counsel in order to make sure that is the approach that you want to take. But there's also other opportunities to increase diversity in organization, and that can be through leadership, right? And in other ways, without having to go through all of those types of analyses. Wendy, I think you had something here. This was taking you into maybe our next set of slides too. And
yeah, let me see. I see that also this request for proposal also allows for sufficient room for legal compliance, but it's still a pretty clear ask, right? And so, yeah, that actually is our segue to our next slide, which is the legal framework for exempt organizations. And so this is a very specialized area of the law, and it really much varies depending on the type of exempt organization seeking exemption. But at the very, very general level, when seeking federal tax exemption, an organization must be organized and operated exclusively for exempt purposes set forth in Internal Revenue Code, Section 501c3. And educational organizations, as defined in a subsection of 501c3, which is Section 170B1A2, are actually prohibited statutorily from engaging in racial discrimination. And even when they are seeking tax exemption in their application for federal exemption, educational organizations have to show that they have a policy against racial discrimination. However, the code doesn't have anything specifically regarding the legality of non-educational organizations engaging in other types of discrimination beyond racial discrimination. And so this is important for exempt organizations that are seeking to diversify or that are seeking to incentivize diversity. And so something that these organizations should be aware of is the public policy doctrine, especially as you're seeking to incentivize diversity. And I'm thinking specifically of the example in RFP3, how it was a very clear ask, but it was very general, and there was no mention of race or quotas of that sort. So public policy doctrine is the notion that any activity violating public policy or any illegal activity is providing sufficient grounds to risk a nonprofit's tax exempt status, right? So you essentially can't ask your grantees to break the law for you because your exempt status is at risk. And in terms of racial discrimination in schools, we know that's very clear. That's in the code. But there's a question of whether racial discrimination is allowed by organizations other than schools. So the answer is yes. You don't have to be a school to be prohibited from engaging in racial discrimination. In Bob Jones University, a private school was denied its tax exempt status for a racial discriminatory admissions policy against interracial marriage and dating. This was in the early 80s. And there the court made it clear that racial discrimination, whether it's being done by an educational organization or not, is a violation of the public policy doctrine, and thus deeming it justifiable denying a tax exempt or nonprofits exempt status, right? So going back to RFP3, where the ask was to demonstrate diversity, and even RFP2, where there was an opportunity to discuss the needs for DI priorities, those proposals would likely not rise to a violation of the public policy doctrine in Bob Jones. And interestingly enough, Bob Jones didn't actually change their policy until 2000, and they didn't regain their tax exempt status until 2017. So 17 years after changing their racial discriminatory policy. I thought that was interesting. That took a long time for them to get their nonprofit status back. And the second question, whether organizations can discriminate on grounds other than race. The Internal Revenue Code doesn't say anything about that, and there is no case law that that discusses that. But the IRS did, in a private letter ruling, state that the implication of the Bob Jones decision does extend to any activity violating a clear public policy. And so these are just doctrines, and these are just some concepts we want you all to keep in mind, especially as, from the grant making perspective, if organizations are seeking to incentivize diversity, there's a balance that can be held. There's a way to, going backwards. There's a way to incentivize diversity without going all the way to the Bob Jones scenario. And other considerations beyond risking your tax-exempt status. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the college admissions scandal, but there was a Netflix documentary on it. So if you haven't seen it, I would encourage it. But there are collateral consequences beyond losing your tax-exempt status, like the public and social implications of having discriminatory and unethical practices and having them highlighted in a Netflix documentary, right? Like, that's pretty embarrassing and probably bad for business or for any type of work that you're engaging in. So that's my legal spiel. I'll hand it off over to Afshan to get us here to the gist of what we're all really here for.
Thanks, Wendy. So, the first part, we talked about how diversity within an organization can be taken into account. What I'm going to share a little bit about is the other side of things, where we're talking about creating more inclusive communities and building a more equitable society. And thinking about that slide where we were looking at communities of color, in particular, communities that may have been marginalized or overlooked, and how do they give, and what does a community-centered approach to diversity look like? And so when we think about community philanthropy, it's engaging with members of the community that we serve at all different levels, right? Decision-making, service, staffing, resources. It's a community-centered approach, and it brings people together in order to answer a question that is ultimately going to affect them, right? And so it's community-centered at all different levels. And I will share an example in the next slide of a project that I'm leading to give you an idea of what community-centered philanthropy looks like, as well as maybe some different legal implications that you may want to consider or think about that are not quite from the internal perspective. So the project that I lead is the Hassan Standard, and it is a legal screening and research project that is intended to promote the equitable inclusion of marginalized or overlooked communities. And the pilot project is actually specifically centered on Muslim nonprofits and examining all the ways in which there have been reasons why there has been discrimination and or lack of access to the public space, examining what those reasons are, and then building and designing a project through leadership, funding, participation at all different levels. And the idea is to empower that level of diversity in the public space. It takes a deeper, it requires a deeper look into what those obstacles are in the first place, whether they're legal barriers, whether they are other types of social barriers, and thinking about how to invest and address those specific obstacles. So for example, for the community of Muslim-led nonprofits, some of those barriers have been related to issues of Islamophobia or concerns of the way that funding is tied to terrorism and national security. And underlying that are issues of governance, risk, and compliance, which are oftentimes issues for small and mid-sized nonprofits anyway. But when you take a look at the way that creates implications for Muslim-led nonprofits, it creates a whole other story, right? And so it's going deep into the intervention and designing a project around that. And when we also talk about community-centered approaches, we could also look at, for example, immigrant communities, and maybe that means understanding the intersection of immigration law and what status means and how to invest in immigrant communities or immigrant serving organizations and where the intersection of the law and nonprofit works, right? So it's taking a very different approach. It's looking at some of the external and social factors that are happening. And it may also mean that there's a desire from the funding side to invest in causes that require supporting advocacy and or C4 work, which can be trickier, and it requires a different level of competency and charitable expenditures for private foundations, but it may mean gaining a different skill set in order to think about how to promote diversity in the public space and overcoming some of those obstacles. And next slide. I think you're on mute, Wendy.
I'm muted, yeah.
I can continue to the slide. So, what we wanted to kind of highlight here are some takeaways from what we've been talking about over maybe the last 20 to 30 minutes. Gosh, it's already 7 o'clock my time, but it's been 30 minutes. And we just wanted to share a little bit about what are ways that we can achieve diversity and look to achieving diversity in philanthropy without having to kind of think so specifically and narrowly, like diversification of staff and some of those other implications. It could just mean becoming more diverse in the boardroom, whether that's at the grant making level, whether that's at the grantee level, whether that's recognizing that communities of color give in different ways and recognizing what types of development arms or strategies to have to attract a diverse donor base. So that's one. I'll turn it over to Wendy, who can share some of the rest.
And Grant, I'm not muted, right? Okay, just checking. It never gets old. And from the grant maker's perspective, this can look like revisiting internal policies in grant making and ensuring that these internal policies themselves are also community-centered and aimed at really attempting to achieve diversity beyond just where the funding is going. And another thing that we'd want you to walk away with is just taking some lessons from corporations code here in California regarding SB 826 and AB 979. And so these are SB 826 is a 2018 law that was signed by then Governor Brown. And this is the law, I'm sure most California folks have heard about it. This is the law that mandates public companies headquartered in California to have at least one woman on their boards by the end of 2019. And the law has built-in future increases depending on the board size. So boards that are 6 directors or more require 3 women, 5 directors, 2 women, and 4 or less directors, at least 1 woman. And this law doesn't apply to nonprofits, but this is a lesson that the nonprofit sector can look at in terms of diversifying their board. And AB 979 was signed into effect last year by Governor Newsom and requires that by the end of this year, 2021, California headquartered public companies have at least 1 director on their boards who is from an underrepresented community, which the statute defines. And so these are just, two current law trends that we wanted to point at and have you all consider, and perhaps getting ahead of the code, or just despite these are being challenged for their constitutionality because of their quotas, but nonetheless, these are lessons that grant making corporations can consider, and even grantee organizations. Afshan, did you want to add anything to the achieving diversity, or anyone in the Zoom room?
I'm good, Wendy.
Awesome. So this concludes our presentation part of today's webinar. This is our contact information.